The Dancing Plague in Strasbourg, a story of madness that chilled the blood. It was the summer of 1518. The oppressive heat bore down on the streets of Strasbourg, as if the entire city was trapped in a fiery cage. At that time, Strasbourg was home to almost 10,000 people, living with their daily worries and routines. But that summer, something dark began to awaken beneath the city's surface, something that would tear apart everything people once thought of as normal. One day, as the sun was just rising and casting a golden light over the city, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped into the main square. She was a woman of few words, with gray hair falling loosely around her shoulders and a preference for long, faded dresses. Hardly anyone knew her name, so when she began to dance in the middle of the square, most people didn't even recognize her. It wasn't ordinary dancing. Her movements were slow, erratic, as though something unseen pulled her from place to place. People first looked on in confusion, then in alarm. Frau Troffea danced for hours without stopping, and as night fell, the square filled with whispers. Where was her family? Why wouldn't she stop? Was it a curse? A demonic ritual? Soon a crowd gathered around Frau Troffea, watching as the dancing frenzy took hold of her. Yet she continued, unmoved by their stares. She danced all night, and when she finally collapsed, exhausted and barely breathing, someone in the crowd whispered, "This is only the beginning." After Frau Troffea fell, many thought the madness had ended. But the next morning, Hans, an elderly blacksmith with a hardened face and hands rough from years of work, appeared in the square. Hans wasn't one for dancing. He used to say dancing was for the young and the foolish. But that morning, he walked into the square with an empty stare, his movements strong at first, then chaotic. Hans had a son, Thomas, who watched in horror as his father danced. He tried to pull him away, but Hans only shook his head, mumbling, "I can't stop. Thomas, I can't stop." The next day, Katerina, a young mother of two, joined the dancing crowd, her face twisted with despair. She moved with a feverish intensity as her children watched from the edge of the square. Their mother danced on, seemingly possessed, until she too collapsed. Her movements were frantic, her eyes hollow, as if she had surrendered to some invisible force that consumed her. And so it began. Each day, more and more people were struck by this dancing madness. People from all over the city, young and old, moved in a trance toward the square and danced until their bodies could no longer bear the strain. As the dancing continued and the madness grew, the city council decided to take action. Officials called upon the best physicians and astrologers to explain this unusual behavior. Physicians diagnosed it as a blood fever, a condition in which the blood boils, compelling the body to release excess energy. A massive project began. A wooden stage was built in the square, and musicians were hired to encourage the dancers further. They believed that if the dancers were pushed to exhaustion, the madness would pass. But as the music filled the air and the instruments played through the night like cries from hell, something unexpected happened. The dancers' movements grew more frantic, and the sounds of their shoes on the cobblestones echoed like a chorus of horror. The music joined them, but instead of tiring them, it seemed to drive them deeper into the madness. Among the dancers was an old woman named Margareta, who had always claimed to have a connection with spirits. Before the mania took her, she said she could hear whispers in her ear. As she danced, she screamed names no one had ever heard before. People watched in awe as she continued to dance until she finally collapsed, her body falling still on the ground. When the music failed to stop the dancers, the city council turned to the church. They called upon the Strasbourg bishop and a procession of priests and monks to cleanse the dancers of evil forces. Priests sprinkled holy water on the square and recited psalms, but it was as if the demons had grown stronger. Among the priests was a young man named Stefan, who had lived most of his life in a monastery and had never seen anything like this. Stefan wandered the streets at night, praying for the souls of those who danced to exhaustion. One night, he knelt in the middle of the square, surrounded by dancers, and recited psalms, hoping they might miraculously stop. But no one heard him. The dancers trampled over him, oblivious to his presence, and Stefan, despairing and alone, realized that their souls were beyond his reach. One day, some of the dancers broke away and ran through the streets, screaming strange phrases. "They're coming for us," they yelled, as if they could see things no one else could. The crowd followed them to the river, where they threw themselves into the water, desperate to escape their fate. Their bodies were later found lifeless, but their faces were twisted in a bizarre grin. Strasbourg gradually became a ghost of itself. Many townspeople who managed to escape abandoned their homes, fearing that the curse would cling to them. The death toll rose, and those who survived walked as shadows, having lost all hope. As the madness finally faded, the city shut its doors. The square remained empty, but the air was thick with a sense of dread. Families carried their dead to burials with silent tears, while priests performed last rites. Above the city, a haunting silence loomed, a silence more chilling than any sound. Strasbourg endured, but it was never the same. For years, locals whispered that when the skies turned dark and the wind carried dust over the abandoned square, you could still hear faint murmurs, as if the souls of those who danced to death were never truly freed.